I'm so glad you're here. Some of you, in fact, have been to every one of these webinars since I started offering them in April 2020. And I'm just so pleased that you've spent this time with me. And others of you, this is your first time. Welcome to you very much. You are a valued member of this community. I can't wait to introduce Beth. But first, I just have a few comments, provide a little context, introduce myself. I'll start by giving you a little update on New York City, which I've done every time in every webinar. That's where I'm based. And the news continues to be good. New York is busy. You can tell by pedestrian traffic, I think. I've always said, and you've heard me say, that pedestrians in New York City simply don't know how to walk. They take over the sidewalk, they stop in the middle of traffic, and that's how we can tell tourists. But we welcome them, and it's wonderful to see. I'm going to share my screen and share with you that we have some new offerings to talk about. We're actually booked all the way through June, but you'll notice that Mastering the Writing Process is in February. I think that's going to be really interesting. I'm going to discuss various authors, various processes, because we each have to find our own. In March, set the stage about setting. Setting is metaphor, setting is subplot, setting to add intrigue and suspense. And in April, point of view, how you decide whose story is being told and who's telling it. I think that's going to be very interesting. You notice, and these are all free, of course, you have to register so we know where to send the link. The Mystery Mastermind virtual workshops are just starting this weekend. The first session was yesterday, and crime fiction tomorrow. They do sell out. So far, everyone has sold out within hours or certainly a day or two. So if you want to get notice of the next cycle, do get on the insider list. You'll get first notice. You'll also notice over on the left of the screen, the YouTube shorties. These are 1 to 3 minute little videos that answer a frequently asked question. Again, free. And I'm sure John is putting the link in chat. He sends out one every Wednesday if you subscribe. They're always there, but that's where you'll be able to get a little tip every Wednesday. 1 to 3 minutes. John has also set up a bookstore on my website. So if you'd like any signed books, do get in touch. Glad to personalize them. And of course, I love spending time at conferences and MFA workshop residencies. That's actually where I met Beth last August. There's a little foreshadowing. She was there to accept the Housatonic Award for Best Middle Grade and Young Adult Middle Grade, one of the biannual awards given by Western Connecticut State University. They have a low residency MFA in creative and professional writing. I'm one of the mentors there. It's a wonderful program. And as you can tell from the books that are up there, I write both fiction and nonfiction. I write the Josie Prescott Antiques Mysteries, all published by St. Martin's Minotaur, Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine. And I write about the craft of writing. Both of these books won the Agatha Award. And I'm a contributing editor for Writer's Digest magazine. I'm also a member of the full-time faculty at Lehman College, which is part of the City University of New York. And I'm now part of Writer's Digest University. I'm doing 4 presentations for them this year. February 9th is the first one on mastering suspense, structure, and plot. I'm very pleased about that. It's going to be packed information, I think. And I'm the chair of the Black Orchid Novella Award, named one of the best contests by Reedsy. We were pretty excited about that. I think we're in our 17th cycle now. If you win, you get $1,000 publication in Alfred Hitchcock. And if you can get yourself to New York, first weekend in December, we fetch you in style at our gala. When I say the award is issued in partnership between Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine and the Wolf Pack. The Wolf Pack is the literary society that celebrates all things Nero Wolfe, Rex Stout's legendary detective. Because so many of you have been hearing me talk about my work in progress. 5 years, 48 drafts. 48 drafts while I've wrestled with structure and genre. Was it women's fiction? Was it psychological thriller? What was it? And it is a thriller. And I am thrilled to share with you that I have finished the first draft of the final version. And I've given myself a March 31st deadline to whip it into shape to send to my agent. I can't tell you how relieved I am. This story has been with me for so long, and I finally found the structure. And I'm very pleased with what I've done so far. We'll see. May not sell, but it won't be for lack of effort on my part. And that's all we can do, right? Finally, each month I show you a garden or something in a garden. And look what I found this week while I was walking in Tudor City Greens. Those are the little parks not far from my apartment where I walk almost every day. And there at the entry, little gated area, there's a garden gnome. How cute is that? He just appeared. And I was very pleased to make his acquaintance. And there he is. So on that note, I now have the very great pleasure of introducing Beth Vrabel.
Hi, everyone.
Beth is the author of a dozen middle grade novels, including the critically acclaimed book, To Tell You the Truth, Cybils nominated Caleb and Kit, ILA award-winning, A Blind Guide to Stinkville. Don't you love that title? And LJLG selection, A Blind Guide to Normal. Another great title. As I mentioned, I met Beth last August at the WestCon summer residency when she accepted the Housatonic Award for the Newspaper Club. Beth, I'm just so pleased you're here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and to have a chance to reconnect with you after a wonderful residency in August when we first got the chance to not only hang out, but to share meals together and get to know each other pretty well.
Yeah, yes. I know what you're referring to. We'll get there in a moment. Let's start by defining middle grade. Would you explain what it refers to when editors and agents and authors say, I write middle grade or I want middle grade?
Certainly. It's a broad age group. Our readers are between ages 8 and 14, which so much happens in a person's life between that age. This is really a holding point for when readers have stretched beyond the point of the I can read early chapter books, and they've stepped into independent reading for enjoyment. Middle grade fiction covers all sorts of subgenres, everything from fantasy like Percy Jackson to nonfiction like the I Survived series, books in verse, as well as contemporary fiction, which is what I write. The word count for younger middle grade fiction can be about 35,000 words, which is a pretty slim volume, to 60,000 plus for upper middle grade, where you're tiptoeing closer to that young adult section.
60,000, that's significant, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, my books tend to be in the 55 to 65,000 range. These are, I'm sure you remember, I felt it even at the residency the first time when walking into the dining hall, wondering which table can I sit at? Where will I be welcome? That's middle grade fiction. It's really a focus on when to fit in, where you might fit in, and also when to stand out and how to do that. That's the crux of so many wonderful middle grade books.
You say that middle grade is ever expanding. Can you explain that?
Sure. I think juggernaut sales of books like the Harry Potter series, like the book Wonder, Percy Jackson. All of these have displayed that middle grade shouldn't be dismissed as a rich story ground for readers of all ages, not just that target audience. There's a shared experience. We've all gotten through that age group. We all are experts on what it's like to be that age, and we all have stories to share from that age. You just got to put them on the paper and send it out into the world. And there's such freedom with what you can write as well within middle grade that I think allows it to be expansive. I'm seeing a huge growth, particularly with graphic novels and graphic novelization of existing middle grade novels. There are ways to incorporate different entry points for reluctant readers. You can start off each chapter with the dialogue on a podcast, for example, the way that Dress Coded starts, a middle grade novel by Carrie Firestone, which is fabulous. Or you can write in verse. There are all sorts of ways to step into that middle grade fiction genre.
This relates to the idea of belonging versus fitting in. That's Brene Brown. She is the director of the Center for Storytelling at the University of Houston. And the last time I looked, her TED Talk on vulnerability had something like 35 million views.
Yeah.
So she is considered the expert, but I'll never forget how she defines those terms, that if you adhere to the mores of any certain group, they're likely to welcome you with open arms. But so you will fit in, but that has no idea with where you truly belong. And that one of the chief responsibilities of becoming an adult is figuring out where you're accepted for who you truly are, where you actually belong. So that's in keeping with what you were talking about. But I want to segue from that idea of fitting in versus belonging, which table at lunch should I sit at, to the idea of middle grade fiction being issue oriented. I've always heard that. Is that true?
In some respects, it is. In middle grade fiction, sort of as you've touched on, unlike other genres where you're looking to connect with other people, mostly, within middle grade, you're figuring out how to be a human. You're figuring out how to trust and believe in yourself. And there are issues that are touched on within that framework. You're becoming aware of an expanding world. You're becoming aware of social issues, of the fact that the adults in your life might not have all the answers and often don't. You're learning how to not only be a friend, but that some friendships aren't for you. Often for the first time at that age is where you're encountering these issues. So it makes sense that would appear in the pages of the story too. But for marketable middle grade fiction, you need a hook. You need something that's really going to pull a reader through a story, a high concept, the way I feel you would in any other genre. Some sort of structure that helps you not only give that elevator pitch of what is your story about, but also that the reader can sink into and then encounter these broader issues.
That reminds me of the idea that you don't write a book about a novel about autism. You write a book about a boy who has autism to make the broader point. Is that analogous?
I believe so. And I think in middle grade, even the readership is savvy enough where they wouldn't want a book about a reader with autism as much as they would crave a book written by someone who lives with autism and can authoritatively and authentically tell that story. I think it's pretty easy as adults to dismiss the sophistication of readers of this age group. And that's something I need to be mindful of as a middle grade reader, that even though my reader's world might be smaller than mine in many respects, they're not worrying about taxes, they're not worried about mortgage rates or anything like that, they do still have the same amount of worry. They have the same amount of concerns and feel emotions as vibrantly as any adult does. It's just their view is a little more myopic.
You just said two things that I want to follow up on. And one is that the idea of cultural appropriation of some sort, that you don't, as a non-autistic person, or you're saying you would not write that book.
I personally wouldn't. I think it could be done with research, with a lot of sensitivity, with a lot of reliance on experts, with a lot of guidance on how to do it well. I think all of that could definitely be managed and done very well. But personally, I feel more comfortable sticking to topics that I can more fully grasp.
Shimon Dowd of The London Eye is a wonderful book about a boy. It's a middle grade mystery in which the detective is an autistic boy. Mm-hmm. And it's one of my favorite books, actually, but it's written a long time ago. And I think the sensibilities have shifted some. Mm-hmm. So I just want to throw that out there. The other thing you talked about was you used the term high concept. Mm-hmm. Could you define that for us all?
I can certainly try. High concepts for me is referring to something that readers can really wrap their hands around. For example, the newspaper club. It's about a group of kids whose newspaper closes in their hometown, so they decide they're going to write their own stories, and they go out and they collect the stories in their community. I can sum that up in one sentence. That's the concept. It's also about friendships. It's about encountering loss. It's about dealing with grief. It's about the way that a community can change. And it's also about media literacy and how to define what makes a good news story, how to discern a good source versus a bad source. All of these murkier, broader issues are enveloped in the story, but the concept is very crisp.
Wow. You just described something that is a perfect elevator pitch, plus thematic information. And those themes are big and consequential and common.
Thank you.
In terms of the loss, I mean, that's great. That is a study right there in how to answer the question, what's your book about?
Thank you.
You're welcome. What kind of characters work best in middle grade?
My favorite are flawed characters all the way. Characters who are a little quirky, who are figuring themselves out, who are silly at times. Basically, any middle grader that you're going to meet. Yes.
What kind of flaws?
What kind of flaws? Maybe still a little selfish. Maybe self-serving. Maybe they're not quite to the point where they know how to be a good friend, but they're trying. Or they make assumptions about the adults around them that are not based in truth, but are based in their experiences.
Are any issues off limits? Are there any plots that you mentioned you wouldn't write autism because you don't have that, you wouldn't have confidence in your knowledge to do it, to represent it properly? That's personal to you. Are there any issues that middle grade editors, agents just would go screaming into the night in horror?
You definitely need to find the right publisher, which I think exists for any issue, so long as it's written carefully and mindfully of the audience. I was considering this quite a bit. Are there any issues off limits within middle grade? And I don't think that there are. I think there are some that are going to be harder sells. I think there are ones that need a lot more couching, a lot more tenderness as you approach them. But if you look at what's on the shelf for middle grade right now, it does touch a very broad spectrum of issues. climate change. Going back to Carrie Firestone to talk about the first role of Climate Club, that's dealt with this huge issue that we're all grappling with, is boiled down to how it's affecting this one small group of students in this small New England town. Social issues, like Jasmine Warga's beautiful novel, Other Words for Home. There are huge issues that can be handled with middle grade if you're willing to look at it through the lens of one particular student or one particular reader, one particular child, and how they might encounter that issue. Another example of that would be the war that saved my life. Here's World War II being distilled into the experience of one child. So I think it certainly can be done. It needs to be carefully done too.
Speak, Laurie Anderson, right? Where it's a 13-year-old whose acquaintance raped.
Mm-hmm.
So that certainly is an example of a very tough issue.
And that's actually classified, I believe, as young adult. Even
it?
though the protagonist is 13. So sometimes the issue can be the thing that pulls it into that.
I see.
Range.
Can you help us understand that difference between middle grade and young adult? Because obviously it's not just the age of the protagonist.
Right. They do often, brush hands. Middle grade can often be subcategorized as younger middle grade and upper middle grade. I've written both. The Newspaper Club, for example, is younger middle grade. Another title of mine, The Humiliations of Pippi McGee, is upper middle grade. It's about a girl who is in 8th grade, staring high school in the face, wants to enter the halls of her high school, having left behind all of these humiliations that she's carried with her through middle school. That's very close to becoming young adult. She has a crush on someone. They're a little flirty with each other. If it had developed into a relationship, then it would have probably gone into that young adult genre. Middle grade tends to, in my perspective and in my experience in publishing, middle grade is focused more on the development of the individual. The individual's learning about themselves and how to trust and believe in themselves. Whereas in young adult, you're learning how to be in relationships with the world.
Well, that's a very interesting distinction. Is that why you write middle grade?
I think I have some nostalgia for it. I was 10 the first time I wrote a short story for myself. It was a terrible short story that I wrote because I was bored one day and I ran out of library books. But it was the first time that I wrote a story. I shared it with someone, shared it with my mom, and she said, "Someday, Beth, you're going to be published."
Oh, that's so nice.
At that age, that was the first time I could dream of seeing a book with my name on the spine. And I think that might be why I always go back to middle grade. I've tried other genres. I've had some success in other types of writing, but middle grade is just where my voice lies, where I find my mind going to when I think of a wonderful story. I remember Mrs. Diener reading me the read alouds hour in 5th grade, and us all sitting on the carpet listening to her share this story. And those were all middle grade stories.
You have kids. Do they give you plot ideas?
They're an endless source of inspiration for sure. My daughter is 19 and in college now. My son is 16. So they've aged past middle grade quite a bit, but they still weigh in on my story ideas. I love to talk with my son about the broad ideas before I start writing. My daughter, I bring her in for the nitty gritty. I was just on deadline and she was home from college for Christmas break. And I was able to stay on track because I'd write a chapter every day because that night she'd want a chapter to read. So that kept me going. I spend a lot of time with kids in general. I live in a small town, do a lot of community volunteering. sometimes do some coaching, do a lot of school visits around the country, which is another unique aspect to middle grade, I think.
In what way?
Well, you get to be the school assembly, which is really fun. A little tricky because I don't want to speak for you, Jay, but I think most writers were a bit introverted. It's why we are comfortable spilling our heart on paper instead of in person. And you really got to push yourself out of that comfort zone to stand in front of a microphone in front of middle schoolers, which can be pretty intimidating. But they're also at an age where they're excited for that school visit. They're full of questions. They're still dreaming. They talk about characters like they're their best friends. If they have recess, they're playing the story on the playground, which is such an incredible thing as an author to witness and to hear about. They're still young enough to get really excited about things and to show their excitement, which is a quick shift when you get into like the high school years where you're mostly looking at blank faces.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Linda Landrigan, who's the editor-in-chief of Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, I asked her if she would consider publishing a middle grade mystery as a short story. And she said absolutely, and would welcome them for the Black Orchid Novella Award. That's 15,000 to 20,000 words. We're now, by the way, we're now moving into e-submissions. We're finally transitioning, let us put it that way. She thinks that adults would like to read middle grade. That's her thinking, because her magazine is an adult magazine. But my question to you is, do you think adults, I mean, clearly Harry Potter's as attractive to adults as middle graders. What do you think? Is that a generalization that we could make?
I think the only thing keeping adults from reading down is the perception of, I'm reading a kid's book.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a shame because a good story is a good story. And you can lose yourself in those stories in such, and reflect upon your experiences at that age and how they still affect you today. Rereading my favorite classic middle grade books as an adult, I pull so much more out of it than I did when I was a kid reading them. For example, The Bridge to Terabithia. I don't know if you've ever had the chance to read that story, but
say the name again.
The Bridge to Terabithia. It's a story about a young boy and girl who create their own fantasy land in a fort in the woods, and some tragedy happens throughout the story, and so it's also about the first time encountering grief. Reading it as an adult, I could see it through the parent's perspective in a way that I couldn't as a child, and pull so much more from it in that way. And I think adults are really missing out if they don't allow themselves to revisit that time period. There's a book, Orbiting Jupiter, by Gary D. Schmidt. He's the author of The Wednesday Wars, which won a Newbery. My daughter, when she was, say, 13 or 14, read the book. It's very thin, very quick read. She read it, handed it to me immediately, closed the book, handed it to me and said, "You need to read this." I sat down, I read it that night. The next night, I was tucking my son into bed. He was 9 at the time. And I read him the first chapter. And then we continued reading it together. My husband read it after that. This became a shared experience that we had. Going through what happened in this slim story took us each just a couple of days to finish the book. And suddenly we had something we could talk about at the dinner table. We could relate to each other about. We could extrapolate into what was going on in our own lives. Fast forward a couple of years, we got a puppy. Trying to figure out his name. Jupiter instantly became his name.
That's quite a tribute to that book.
Well, unfortunately, Jupiter the dog has turned out to be a little bit of a jerk. So we love him. We love him dearly, but he's not the best behaved dog.
You mentioned parents. Do parents vet their kids' reading? You're hearing more and more about books being banned at libraries and school systems, which I just find horrifying, but there you go. Are you mindful of that as a possibility, although maybe it increases sales in the rest of the country? Who knows? But are you mindful of critics or parents, committees that may ban books? Are you mindful of that as you write?
It's hard not to be when you hear so much about it, but I do my best not to be overly mindful. I try to keep forefront of my mind, am I serving a young reader? Middle grade has a lot of gatekeepers. It always has, even before this rash. It's somewhat unique in that the consumer, the person reading the book, is often not the one buying the book. Usually it is a school librarian making purchases and making it available in the school. Is a parent or a grandparent or a family friend who's going into Barnes & Noble and choosing which middle grade book to bring home as a gift. So it is tricky in that regard, where you want it to be universally appealing, but still serve the reader. Earlier today, I can tell you a story. I was talking with a friend of mine who is a school librarian, and she was sharing with me that a teacher in her school district was frustrated that one of my upper middle grade books, very close to being young adult, used the word damn in dialogue one time. That was enough to keep it out of her classroom.
Wow.
So your choices do have consequences. You have to decide, is it worth it? In that particular case, in that plot, in that moment, that was the word to use. And I don't regret it. But there are repercussions for theme and content. If you look at the larger issue of book banning, it is a tragedy. It is a disservice. These issues that we're talking about in middle grade on this learning ground on how to be a good person, how to be a good human, what better place to encounter these difficult issues than in the pages of a book? If it's too much for that reader, they can close the book. They can come back to it when they're older. They can talk to a trusted adult about it. But they are going to encounter these issues. And they're going to encounter them in person, or they're going to encounter them on the page, or they're going to encounter it on the internet.
Or in the grocery store.
Or in the grocery store. It's life. And to just decide that this is not something that you're going to provide, this is not a learning ground that you're going to provide for a young reader, it's heartbreaking.
On that note, tell us about your path to publication.
So, as I mentioned, I was about 10 when I first fell in love with writing. I was a very shy kid. And there was a beautiful power to being able to fill a blank page with my own words because I was so scared to say them out loud. So I really just always had a notebook with me, always had a pencil, was always writing stories, observing the world around me with the intent of creating stories from it. But then as I got older, the idea of actually being able to finish a full book became overwhelmingly scary. And I knew I wanted to spend my life writing, but I didn't think I had that capacity. And I studied journalism. I'm grateful for that because I learned so much as a reporter, learned about, the structure of a story, about deadlines, about handling edits well, and also how to research in a way that I don't know that I would have ever gotten had I not had that experience. Also got a series out of my experience as a newspaper reporter. But then when my children were small and I decided to stay home with them, I remembered writing for fiction, writing for joy, writing for me. And I wanted to tiptoe into that again. I remember telling my husband I didn't feel like a real writer because real writers had laptops and they went to coffee shops. And that night when he came home from work, he had a laptop with him.
Oh,
it was very sweet. And so I started writing during nap time, 20-minute increments. I thought everybody has 20 minutes a day. I'm not losing anything by giving that time to this dream, even if it doesn't work out. I've managed to finish a novel It was awful. It was so bad. My mom's the only person who's ever read it. Wrote a second one, which was pretty.
So you never tried to sell the first one?
No, it was bad. I knew it was bad.
Sometimes they're really bad, but you don't know they're bad.
Oh, I knew. I was embarrassed to even let my mother read it. But I knew then that I could do it. I could cover a whole plot. I could cover an idea from beginning to end. So I worked on the second one, and that one was very similar to books that were already on the shelf. It was almost a step away from fanfic. Like I was trying really hard to make my story what was selling at the time. And that got a few nibbles from agents. I did query that one, all of who said there's nothing distinctive about this.
It's familiar, but not fresh.
Exactly. So I wrote a third, and this was a story only I could tell. It was very flawed, but it was still a fresh story. And that got me the call with an agent. I queried that one as well. My wonderful agent, Nicole Rocinity, called me and said, I like this story. I think we can improve it. I'm going to try to sell it, but it's probably not. It's not very marketable. What are you working on now? And at that point, I was trying a new middle grade story, and I was telling her about that. And she said, that sounds awesome. I can't wait to read it. And that became my first novel, Pack of Dorks. It was still a tricky journey. Pack of Dorks was on the market on sub for almost a year. It was about 10 months. But then once, it only takes one yes, and then once that story was published, things escalated very quickly, and I've had 1 or 2 books released every year since.
That's excellent. That's excellent. And how did you decide which agents to query?
That took some finessing as well. I got, at that time, it was in print. It's now all online, a resource called Writer's Market. And I relied on that to look into what agents were taking on new clients. I would go into bookstores and libraries, look at my favorite books that felt like comp titles, see who was representing those authors, reach out. They're almost always thanked in the acknowledgments if you're looking for how to figure out which agents are covering which clients. I read a lot of Query Shark in working on my query letter.
It's Janet Reed's blog. Janet Reed, REID. She is herself an agent, and she writes an excellent blog called Query Shark.
I believe it was it. I might be giving her miscredit, but I believe it was her where I've read to send out your query letters in batches of 10. If you send out 10 query letters and you get no responses, there's something wrong with your query letter. It needs to be reworked. If you send it out in batches of 10 and you get a few nibbles from agents who ultimately passed, there's something wrong with your draft. And that needs to be addressed. I used that advice quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's where I got.
I want to do a quick fire round of questions about your writing process, and then we'll open it up to the group for questions. And John will facilitate that part. So if you have any questions and you haven't yet put them in the question Q&A folder there, please feel free. Do you write every day?
Yes. In some respects, Jane, I consider the time spent thinking about my story writing time. Reading top titles, writing time. I spend time every day working on my profession, whether those are actually words on page, different thing.
Do you spend a lot of time promoting the work? You mentioned doing school visits. Do you set those up yourself?
Sometimes. I with my early books, I had to do a lot more legwork. Now it's more of an invitation often. School librarians are a very loyal group. They're very talk with each other quite a bit. So often one school visit will leapfrog into another one. I probably should spend more time on the marketing part. It's not my comfort zone. I've been checking out your list of events. I'm going to be joining some of those as well. But yeah, that's
great.
Not something that comes easily to me as much as working on the next thing.
I think you're in very good company. I think for a lot of us, it's just not why we became writers. When you're writing, do you write to a quota of a certain number of words?
I do. When it depends on which stage of the process I'm in. If I'm in the early chapters or the late chapters, my goal is 3,000 words a day. Because that's
3,000 words a day?
Yeah, that's when I'm really chugging.
Oh my goodness. Are you kidding me?
I don't often make it, but that's my goal. That's when I feel like I had a really good day.
Wow.
When I'm in the middle section, I'm very happy if I can reach 1,000 words a day. I don't know how it is with you, but I always have a very clear picture before I get started of what my beginning and what my ending is. It's the meeting of them in the middle.
Yeah. No, I use my own plotting roadmap, which is, by the way, in my craft books. And so I know all of the major plot twists and where the danger is going to come and so on. So what I have to do is get from here to there. So I'm only writing I say to myself, all you have to do is cover the next 70 pages or so.
Okay.
Because you know you're getting to that twist. And then you go to the next 50 or so, whatever it is. The thriller's much faster. So that's been a different experience, but that's interesting in terms of plotting. Do you write longhand first?
No. I have a blank notebook that I keep next to me the whole time that I'm writing, where I will write snippets of what broader ideas that I want to get back to, or loose ends that I need to eventually stitch back up. But everything is in a platform called Scrivener for me, a software called Scrivener.
Great. Do you write to silence? Do you have music in the background? Is the TV on?
I think I can blame my days as a reporter for the need to have a lot going on in the background. So I never write in silence. That would be so uncomfortable. I hate when I go to a coffee shop and I've forgotten my headphones too, because I also love music. So I have a playlist for every book. Sometimes that's the first thing that I do before writing anything, is come up with the playlist, which is a little bit of a way to kick the can down the road as far as getting started to the actual writing part. But songs that make me feel the way that my characters will in different scenes, that helps motivate me in a really strong way. Sometimes it's the same song, which is dreadful for my family because they hear the same song over and over again.
That's funny.
Months at a time, but or
that's the way that goes.
Yes.
Woman at work.
Exactly.
I have to go back to that 3,000 words and then 1,000. Let's average that out to 2,000 a day. If your books are running 50 to 60,000, you're writing a book in a month?
Well, I'm taking weekends off, and there's a lot of rewriting that goes in that. Where I
a first draft in 6 weeks or something. I just want to battle for you. Wow.
But that's first draft. If we know that that's what happens in your first draft and what happens in the printed product are very, very, very different.
Yeah,
it's almost like a stream of consciousness at that point.
But that's actually why you're able to publish 2 books a year, because you have that discipline and focus, and you're productive. You're diligent about it.
I love this job so much that I want to get as many books out there while I can. It's like that fear of someday somebody's going to be like, oh, we're ready to move on from Beth. I've got to get as many books out there before that happens.
No, you're going to be writing forever. They're wonderful. I gave the newspaper club to my great niece for Christmas, and she just adored it. She just loved it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was nice. My next little note is coffee or whiskey. And that's why we were laughing at the beginning when Beth said that she got to know me pretty well, because I am a Jack Daniels drinker. What do you write to?
Coffee. I'm a caffeinated person, overly caffeinated person. I save the whiskey for when I type the end.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, I don't actually write with while I drink. I will say that. Although Stephen King once said, write drunk, edit sober.
I've heard that. And there have been times when it's tempting, but I think as a middle grade author, that could be nothing but trouble.
Talk about issue oriented.
Right?
Are you a morning person? Night owl?
I am definitely a night owl. The nature of my life of being a parent means I am living as a morning person. But if I had my druthers, if I had my own schedule to keep, I would be writing. I'd start my day probably around 1.
The Newspaper Club is a series. What's next?
We have some ideas for future installments of the Newspaper Club, future adventures for them. My next book that's coming out, though, I just got the advanced reader copies this week. I'll show you that when Giants are. I'm
beautiful.
Excited for this book. This is my first thriller. It is about, it's kind of inspired by Hansel and Gretel, if you could turn it into Hatchet and Gretel. It's about 2 kids who build an airplane, crash it into an ancient forest, and have to find their way out as a wildfire and looters approach them. So very exciting,
Scary.
right? Very scary. Delves into some deeper themes as well. The things that are going to get them out of this forest are the things that made them want to run away to begin with. The skill sets that they've learned and the people that they've encountered. So very excited.
That's fantastic.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun to work. This was a novel that I got to think about. You often hear the adage as a writer, write what you know. This was a book that was write what scares you. If I was in this situation, what would be the worst, scariest thing that could happen?
Yeah.
And that's always the answer to what happens next.
Well, best of luck with that. And just to make sure everybody knows the term, advanced reader copies, ARCs, are review copies. That's what goes to long span publications, media that need time to read, critique, and then publish the review. When is the pub date? When is it coming out?
June 21st.
June 21st. So about 6 months. That tells you the lead time on all of this aspect of it. What advice do you have for writers wanting to break into middle grade market?
Respect your reader. Don't talk down to them. Remember that they are fully people. They are fully human, and they deserve stories that are respectful of them. I noticed in some critique groups with people first trying out middle grade, it's very tempting to have an adult swoop in and save the day. Let your characters be their own heroes. Let them save themselves. Your readers will respect you for that, and they'll get courage and hope from that. It's tricky to do. That's a reason that Disney kills off all the parents, because you have to work within those parameters of a middle grade child's life where they don't have a lot of decision making. They don't have a lot of autonomy. You've got to figure out a way to do that while telling your story. So with regards to middle grade, that would be my biggest advice. The best advice I ever got as a writer, though, in a broader sense, is that your best marketing tool is a new book. Always have something new ready in the pipeline. So because readers are loyal, and if they love your first book, they're going to be looking for the second. So have something available.
Keep writing.
Keep writing. It's addictive too. It's fun.
Wonderful. I just want to start by thanking you so much and then say, John, we're now ready for questions.
Thank you, Jane. This was wonderful.
Excellent. The first question is, I know you mentioned writing for 8 to 14-year-olds as middle grade fiction. Is that also the ages of the characters in general?
Yes. There tend to be certain numbers that writers, publishers really enjoy. So for young middle grade, 10 is usually the age of the protagonist. There are usually 13 is another number that readers seem to love, that publishers seem to love. That's more of the upper middle grade. Readers tend to read up. So the 8-year-olds will be reading the adventures of the 10-year-old. The 10-year-old will be reading the adventures of the 13-year-old. 13-year-olds are probably reading young adult.
Perfect.
Someone asks, is there a preferred viewpoint, first person, third person, etc., for writing middle grade?
You encounter all sorts of viewpoints for that. I've done both. First person, past tense seems to be my preferred go-to. I've also written one of my books, The Reckless Club. It's an upper middle grade. It's about 5 kids who are all serving a day of detention in an assisted living facility, volunteering in an assisted living facility on the last day of school or last day of summer break before high school. The entire story takes place in this one afternoon, shifting perspectives amongst all 5 of the kids. For that book, I used third person, present tense. And that was tough. I don't know that I would go back to that, but it's certainly something that's welcome in middle grade. There aren't really set limits. It's whatever works for that particular story. Because I was writing from the perspective of 5 students, some of whom have very different lived experiences than mine, very different perspectives than I do, I found third person to be useful because I didn't have to go as introspective, but that was just a personal preference.
Thank you.
Someone asks, and you touched on this briefly during your discussion on banned books, is it okay for characters to use cuss words in middle grade fiction?
It's a tricky one. If your publisher is comfortable with it, if your editor is comfortable with it, you certainly could. You will face some repercussions. You might be off state reading lists. For example, you can sometimes find creative ways to say that. One thing I like to do if I need to add that oomph to a story is I will say, and then I heard a word my dad said once when he dropped a hammer on his foot, or a word I'm not allowed to say out loud popped in my head. Find ways to let the reader know this is a time when a curse happened. This was a character who was cussing, but without actually saying it.
It's very clever.
Someone asks, what role do parents typically play in middle grade stories?
This is tricky because, again, you need to create this space for your readers to own their own story. And if you've got a very involved, very good parent, sometimes your plot disappears because a parent would put the kibosh on the events pretty quickly. I usually take it as a personal challenge to figure out how this kid can both have a really good parent and their own adventure. There are ways to kind of carve out that experience, but it is tricky because, again, you don't want to have the parent coming in and saving the day. You want your character to save himself.
Someone asks, I understand as a writer I need to have a voice, but when writing for middle grade, that voice needs to resonate with middle grade readers. How do you find that balance between your voice as an adult and your voice as a middle grade author?
It helps to be a little silly still. It helps to remember and relive your own middle grade experiences and spend some time with kids. I think a mistake that a lot of aspiring middle grade authors make is they're trying to write to kids. They're trying to incorporate lingo or things like, they played Fortnite or they're playing Roblox in the book. By the time your story's published, kids aren't going to play that anymore. There's going to be new lingo that they're going to use. Be silly, be fresh, be thinking like a child, but don't be artificial. Try to be authentic in the story as well. That is a challenge for middle grade writers.
Okay, someone asks, is traditional publication the norm for middle grade fiction, or have you seen people successfully independently publish middle grade fiction as well?
It's tricky for self-publishers to find success with middle grade because of the gatekeeping involved. Oftentimes, your best bet at having a successful, long-lasting middle grade book is to have it in libraries, to have it with school librarians in particular. And they're ordering off of trade reviews, which are difficult to get if you are self-publishing. Not impossible, but challenging. It's also, they're running recommendations off the Junior Library Guild, which is a team of select reviewers who choose certain books to promote, all of which are traditionally published. So it is a challenge to find success with independent publishing. It's not impossible, though. You got to have a lot of hustle. Be willing to go to festivals, be willing to talk up your book, to be willing to go into to cold approach librarians and schools, and to reach out on social media. So it's certainly not impossible, but it is another challenge.
Okay. Someone wants to know, do you outline your books as part of your writing process?
I do. Right now, with where I am in my career, when I started off, I had to have a complete manuscript. And I was less dependent on a plot at that point because I was sort of figuring things out. At this point, I go to publishers on pitch. So I will have a synopsis, which is a rough outline, and the first 3 chapters. And that's what we present to, this is what my agent presents to editors. And we hope to get a contract out of that.
How long is the synopsis, Beth?
Usually about 3 to 5 pages. So pretty detailed. That's my plot then. That's my outline. And I try to hit those notes. I don't often stick to it very well. Usually my ending is the same, but those middle points, they might vary quite a bit as I begin writing the story. But it is something to work with, a framework. I find using note cards, writing quick chapter 1, 2 sentences, what I want to happen in that chapter, chapter 2, and keeping that next to me. Scrivener, the software I use, allows you to have that right next to where you're drafting. But if I didn't have that, I would just use a paper note card with just real quick blip of what I want to happen chapter by chapter to stay on track.
Is there any particular resources you would recommend for writers who are new to creating middle grade?
Yes. I think your best resource is the children's section of your library. Look for the really well-loved books, the ones that have the dog-eared pages, the smudged pages. Take those home with you, read them, get to know what the story structure is like, how it differs from other genres, and really immerse yourself in that. I think talking with school librarians would be a really beneficial thing to do. A great resource that is most likely in your community is the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, SCWBI. It's a trade organization. You can join that. They have monthly meetings, sometimes on Zoom still. You can find critique partners through them. They have special guests. They have meet and greets with editors where you can pick their brains about what they're looking for, agents as well. A really valuable resource usually right in your community.
And I want to jump in and make a comment. At one point, I decided I wanted to write a middle grade mystery. And I did just what you were saying. I spoke to Linda Brown, who at the time was the children's book editor at the mystery bookstore in Los Angeles, sadly since closed, and a middle grade librarian at a school in Wellesley, Massachusetts. So I had geographic diversity. Anyway, I got a list from them of their best loved middle grade books, some of them classics, most of them contemporary. And I got them all and I read them all. I created an Excel spreadsheet with maybe a dozen variables. And what I learned through that experience, which was terrific for me, was that I hated everything about it. They all had quirky characters.
Yeah.
Impossible for me to identify with the situations. And it saved me a year of my life
Yes.
because I didn't go any further with the process. And so I applaud the idea and just would encourage people to be open to the idea that what they may discover is that it's not for you.
Absolutely. I've tried my hand at other genres that I know I cannot pull off. I can still enjoy those stories, but I'm
Absolutely.
not the one to write them.
Back to you, John.
Someone asks, is fantasy popular with middle grade readers outside of the world of Harry Potter?
Oh, yes, definitely. There's a wonderful, wonderful series, Rick Riordan Presents, based in mythology, incredible storytelling. Fantasy is huge in middle grade. It's tough because you are building a world. And that's something that I've tried before and have not yet honed enough skills to perfect. You've got to just look at the world building in middle grade fantasy is so rich and so extreme and so expansive that it's a tough thing to capture the attention of a publisher and to really run with. But when you can, it's really amazing.
What is the name of that series?
Rick Riordan Presents. Rick Riordan is the author of the Percy Jackson series. And his Present is an imprint where it's looking at across the globe at different mythology-based middle grade stories. Really
Thank you.
Kind of on the opposite side of world building and everything you just discussed, do you do detailed character pages about the characters in your books before you write them?
I don't have a set questionnaire, but I think a lot about the characters and I sketch out a lot about their personalities. I even have almost like a vision board, rely on like Pinterest and look for child actors who might look like the character that I have in mind so I can figure out facial expressions when I'm describing them and mannerisms. I try to think about everything from what would be on this character's nightstand to what would be in their pocket, what keeps them up at night, what's the last thing they see before they close their eyes, what's the first thing they think about when they wake up in the morning. These aren't details that are ever going to make it into the book, but it helps the character feel really real enough to me to be able to take them on. This is also something I think about my daughter a lot when I'm at this stage of creating the character, because I'll describe the character with her a lot. I'll talk through the character's motivations and mannerisms with her a lot. And if I get to the point where she'll send me a song to put on my playlist, where she'll say, Raymond would love this song, or this song is so girdy, then I know, okay, this is the character who's become real enough in my mind that it's become real in someone else's as well. And now I can put that character into action.
I want to jump in and ask, how long do you do all of this research? How long does it take you to write the synopsis in 3 chapters? How long to do these character profiles before you begin? Now you have a contract and you're writing.
It is the longest part for me. So coming up with the idea the first step is usually just thinking about ideas, thinking about what I'm curious about, and writing a blurb, like the back cover copy. That might take a month, maybe a month and a half. I'll send that to my agent. If she writes back, this has a lot of potential, I'm just not ready yet. If she's like, oh my gosh, go for it, then I jump in. And then I start thinking about my characters, doing character profiles, start doing research, allowing the research to just be a ball of yarn that I throw out and let unwind as far as it wants to go. Start thinking about setting. I might go to the place where the book is set, start interviewing people who have experiences that can provide insight for when giants burn, as an example. With the wildfire, I interviewed firefighters, smoke jumpers, wildfire containment experts, survivalists, people who live off the grid, amateur pilots. I went to amateur pilot meetings and learned how to build my own aircraft. I thought about getting in a couple of the planes, but I didn't. Not that phrase. Talked with Civil Air Patrol experts, visited the forest where I want this to be said in Idaho. All of that before I ever began truly drafting. I might have had like a few chapters bubbling around, but was not in the story. It is the most fun part of it.
I prefer research to write.
Yeah, so when you can dream so big, you can throw that huge net and have no doubt that you can pull it off. But then you get the contract and a deadline, and now you've got to actually do it.
That's right. I suspect we have time for one more question, John.
Let's see. One more question we have. Do you have any hints for making dialogue sound believable without using words or word choices that will make it sound dated in time?
Yes. Read your draft out loud. Listen as you're giving the dialogue. Does it sound natural? Does it sound like something you would overhear at the park or at the mall? And try to incorporate that, edit it down. I think dialogue tags often can be a little bit too long. It's very permissible, very good, even in middle grade, to just have your dialogue tag be said. He said, she said, as you run your dialogue, try not to veer into, he exclaimed, he remarked loudly as he blah, 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 blah. Don't weigh down your dialogue unnecessarily. Let the dialogue just kind of, for lack of a better word, speak for itself.
And if you're using tags in that way, typically you want to include one every 4 or 5 lines so that readers don't have to hunt for who's talking.
Yes.
But you don't want to use too many because it slows it down. Does that sound right?
It does in my perspective. I think readers tend to kind of skip over, like your mind doesn't sit with the word said. You just recognize that who's speaking and you keep going. But you kind of snake them out of the story if you try to get a little too fancy with your dialogue.
And on that note, I guess we're out of time. I can't thank you enough, Beth. This has been wonderful and insightful. You've been so generous with your knowledge.
Thank you so much. This has been a pure joy, and I'm so excited to get to hang out with you again.
Indeed. I look forward to our next get-together.
Me too.
And everybody, as always, I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. And in the meantime, I hope you find great strength and solace from reading and writing.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
On.
Have a great weekend, everyone.